At 0300 hours on March 17, 1943, Second Officer Robert Carr stood on the bridge wing of the SS Mathew Luckenbach and watched the convoy scatter. 42 merchant ships that had crossed 3,000 miles of Atlantic together were breaking formation. The escorts were gone. The British destroyer that had been their shield for 11 days had turned back at the mid-ocean meeting point. The American destroyers that were supposed to meet them had not arrived. A U-boat wolf pack was closing from the north. Convoy SC 121 was alone. Carr was 28 years old. He had made 6 Atlantic crossings since Pearl Harbor. He had watched 2 ships sink on his 3rd crossing, torpedoed at night, gone in minutes. He had helped pull survivors from the water on his 4th crossing, men coated in fuel oil, lungs burned from inhaling fumes, skin frozen from the North Atlantic. He knew what happened when U-boats found an unescorted convoy. The Mathew Luckenbach carried 8,000 tons of military cargo. Steel beams, trucks, ammunition, aviation fuel in drums, crated aircraft engines, medical supplies. Everything the British needed to keep fighting. Everything the Germans wanted to prevent from arriving. Carr looked at the radar screen. The primitive surface search radar showed nothing, but radar could not detect submarines running submerged. The U-boats were out there. They were always out there. The captain, William Donahue, gave the order. All ahead full. Course 090. They would run for it. Every ship for itself. The convoy system had broken down completely. The Mathew Luckenbach's engines pushed her to 14 knots. That was fast for a cargo ship, but not fast enough to outrun a surfaced U-boat that could make 17 knots. The ship had one 5-inch gun mounted on the stern. That was the defensive armament. One gun, operated by a naval armed guard crew of 8 sailors commanded by an ensign barely 20 years old. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The gun could not stop a torpedo. The United States Merchant Marine was not a military service in the traditional sense. Merchant seamen were civilians. They worked for private shipping companies under contract to the War Shipping Administration. They wore no uniforms, took no oath, received no military training. They were simply hired to transport cargo from American ports to war zones across the Atlantic and Pacific. No one forced them to sail. They could quit at any time. They could refuse to board ships heading into submarine-infested waters. Some men did refuse. They stayed in port, found other work, waited for the war to end somewhere safe. Most men sailed anyway. The pay was good, triple what a factory worker earned, hazard pay for crossing war zones. The adventure appealed to young men who wanted to see the world. The patriotism motivated older men who remembered the last war and wanted to contribute to this one. And some men simply needed work, any work, regardless of the danger. By 1943, the United States had the largest merchant fleet in history. Over 5,000 cargo ships, tankers, and transports. The fleet carried everything required for a global war. Food, fuel, weapons, ammunition, vehicles, aircraft, medical supplies, construction materials, replacement parts, spare equipment, and millions of tons of raw materials needed to sustain Allied industrial production. Britain could not feed itself without American wheat and meat. The Soviet Union could not arm itself without American trucks and steel. The Mediterranean theater could not function without fuel from American tankers. The Pacific offensive required cargo ships carrying supplies across 6,000 miles of ocean. Without the merchant marine, the Allies could not fight. Without the merchant marine, the war would be lost. German Navy High Command understood this completely. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz commanded the U-boat arm. He had studied the British supply situation since 1939. He knew the mathematics. Britain needed 1 million tons of imports per month minimum to survive. Oil, food, raw materials. Reduce imports below that threshold, and the British economy would collapse. Factories would shut down, armies would run out of ammunition, the population would starve. Donitz proposed a simple strategy. Sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them. Calculate how many ships needed to be sunk per month to reduce Britain's import capacity below the survival threshold. Build enough U-boats to sink that tonnage. Position those U-boats on the convoy routes where merchant traffic was concentrated. Attack relentlessly, day and night, until the shipping lanes were so dangerous that merchant seamen refused to sail and the Atlantic supply line broke completely. The strategy had a name: the Tonnage War. Donitz was not interested in sinking warships or attacking coastal targets or supporting naval operations. He wanted to sink cargo ships and tankers. Ugly, slow, unarmed merchant vessels that could not fight back. Every merchant ship sunk was 7,000 tons of cargo that would never reach Britain. Every tanker sunk was 10,000 tons of fuel oil that British factories could not burn. Every transport sunk was troops and equipment that would never reinforce the Mediterranean. Sink enough ships, and Britain would be forced to negotiate peace. Then Germany would control Europe completely. The United States would be isolated, unable to project power across an ocean that German U-boats dominated. The war would be over. Germany would have won. By 1943, Donitz commanded over 400 U-boats. That was more submarines than any nation had ever deployed. The Germans had built U-boats obsessively since 1939, prioritizing submarine construction over battleships and cruisers. Every shipyard in Germany, France, and Norway was producing U-boats. The Type 7 U-boat was the workhorse. 769 were built during the war. Each boat displaced 767 tons surfaced, displaced 867 tons submerged. They were 220 feet long, 20 feet in beam. They could dive to 750 feet, deeper than Allied depth charges were typically set. They carried 14 torpedoes and could reload while submerged. They had a crew of 44 men. On the surface, they could make 17 knots using diesel engines. Submerged, they could make 7 knots using electric motors for short periods before batteries depleted. Range was 8,500 nautical miles at 12 knots surfaced. That meant U-boats could operate anywhere in the Atlantic. They could patrol off the American East Coast, hunt in the Caribbean, attack convoys in mid-ocean, and still return to bases in France with fuel to spare. The Type 9 U-boat was larger and longer-ranged, built for distant operations. They displaced 1,000 tons surfaced, 1,100 tons submerged. They were 250 feet long and carried 22 torpedoes. Range was 13,500 nautical miles. These boats operated off the coast of South Africa, in the Indian Ocean, along the coast of Brazil. Anywhere merchant ships sailed, German U-boats could reach them. The U-boats operated in wolf packs. Brutal tactic in German. The tactic was Donitz's innovation. Instead of U-boats operating independently, they formed patrol lines across convoy routes. When one U-boat spotted a convoy, it would shadow at long range and radio the position to U-boat headquarters in France. Headquarters would vector other U-boats toward the convoy. 5, 10, sometimes 20 U-boats would converge on a single convoy. They would attack at night from multiple directions simultaneously. Escorts could not defend against attacks coming from all bearings at once. The Wolfpack tactic was devastatingly effective in 1942 and early 1943. Before convoy escorts had sufficient radar, before escort carriers provided air cover, before Allied codebreakers could decrypt German radio traffic reliably. During that period, the U-boats were winning the tonnage war. American merchant seamen understood the statistics. Everyone in the merchant marine knew someone who had died at sea. The casualty reports were posted at union halls in every port. Names of ships sunk, names of crew members lost. The numbers were staggering. In 1942 alone, the Germans sank over 1,400 Allied merchant ships. That was nearly 8 million tons of shipping. The Allies were losing ships faster than shipyards could replace them. If the trend continued, Britain would be starved into submission by mid-1943. The merchant seamen sailed anyway. Robert Carr had enlisted in the merchant marine in January 1942, 1 month after Pearl Harbor. He was from San Francisco, had grown up around ships and docks. His father had been a longshoreman. Carr had worked on coastal freighters during college, then joined the merchant marine when war came. His first ship was a Liberty ship, the SS John Harvey, assigned to North Atlantic convoy duty. Liberty ships were the backbone of the American merchant fleet. 2,700 were built between 1941 and 1945. Each ship displaced 14,000 tons loaded, measured 441 feet in length. They were ugly, boxy, utilitarian vessels, hull made from prefabricated sections welded together. Propulsion from a single steam turbine that pushed the ship to 11 knots maximum speed. They were slow, uncomfortable, and basic in every way, but they could carry 10,000 tons of cargo, and American shipyards could build them in 45 days. The Germans called them assembly line ships, produced like automobiles, cheap and disposable. German naval officers sneered at the Liberty ships' crude construction and slow speed. They assumed such vessels would be easy targets. They were right. Liberty ships were easy to sink, but the Americans built them faster than the Germans could sink them. That was the strategic calculus. The Liberty ships carried everything: locomotives and steel rails, crated aircraft and tanks, ammunition by the thousands of tons, food supplies in enormous quantities, medical equipment, construction materials, vehicles, every conceivable item needed to supply armies across the Atlantic. Each Liberty ship represented 10,000 tons of cargo capacity. Sinking one Liberty ship meant temporarily denying that tonnage to the Allies. But another Liberty ship would launch within a week. The American industrial capacity was overwhelming. In 1943, American shipyards were launching 3 Liberty ships per day. That was over 1,000 ships per year. The Germans could not sink them fast enough. Carr's first crossing on the John Harvey was in March 1942. Convoy HX-178 from New York to Liverpool. 63 merchant ships escorted by 7 destroyers and corvettes. The crossing took 14 days. 2 ships were torpedoed on the 9th night. One sank immediately. The other, a tanker loaded with aviation fuel, exploded in a fireball that lit up the horizon. Carr watched from a John Harvey's bridge. The tanker burned for 30 minutes before sinking. No survivors. The convoy did not stop. That was doctrine. Convoys could not stop for survivors because stopping made every ship vulnerable. The escorts would drop life rafts and radio the coordinates. Rescue ships following behind the convoy would pick up survivors if any remained alive. But in March in the North Atlantic, the water temperature was 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Men in the water lost consciousness from hypothermia in 15 minutes. They died in 30 minutes. Life rafts helped, but only slightly. The cold was lethal. After that first crossing, Carr understood what merchant marine service actually meant. It meant crossing an ocean where submarines hunted constantly. It meant watching ships sink and knowing you could not help. It meant accepting that torpedoes might hit your ship on any night, in any weather, without warning. It meant dying in freezing water if your ship went down. It meant accepting that death as the price of continuing to sail. Many men could not accept it. After their first crossing, they refused to sail again. The merchant marine allowed this. No one could force a civilian to sail into a war zone. Men who refused were blacklisted from further merchant employment, but they kept their lives. Other men accepted the risk and sailed again. Carr sailed again. He made 5 more crossings in 1942 on different ships. Each crossing was the same pattern. Form up the convoy in New York or Halifax. Cross the Atlantic in a formation of columns. Ships spaced 1,000 yards apart. Wait for the U-boats to find the convoy. Endure the attacks. Watch ships sink. Arrive in Britain with fewer ships than departed. Unload cargo. Load ballast for the return voyage. Cross back to America. Repeat. Between July 1942 and May 1943, the U-boats were sinking Allied ships at a rate that threatened to win the war for Germany. The worst period was called Black May by British historians, though the crisis actually lasted from November 1942 through March 1943. During those 5 months, U-boats sank over 2.3 million tons of Allied shipping. That was over 400 ships. In March 1943 alone, 108 Allied merchant ships were sunk. That was the highest monthly total of the entire war. At that rate, Britain's import capacity would fall below the survival threshold within 6 months. The Admiralty calculated Britain would run out of food by October 1943. Factories would shut down from lack of raw materials by December. The military would run out of fuel by January 1944. If the U-boats maintained their March 1943 sinking rate for just 6 more months, Britain would be forced to negotiate peace. The war would be lost. Robert Carr knew none of these strategic calculations when he boarded the SS Mathew Luckenbach in March 1943 for what would be his 7th Atlantic crossing. He only knew the U-boats were getting worse. Convoys were losing more ships, and the escorts seemed unable to protect the merchant vessels under their care. The Mathew Luckenbach was not a Liberty ship. She was a pre-war Hog Islander, built in 1920, 5,000 tons displacement. Faster than a Liberty ship, 14 knots maximum, but older and less reliable. The crew was 42 men. Captain, 3 mates, 3 engineers, radio operator, purser, cook, messman, bosun, carpenter, oiler, fireman, able-bodied seaman, plus the Naval Armed Guard detachment of 8 sailors and 1 ensign operating the stern gun. 51 men total on a ship carrying 8,000 tons of military cargo into the most dangerous ocean in the world. Convoy SC 121 departed New York on March 6, 1943. 42 merchant ships, mostly American, some British, 1 Norwegian, 1 Dutch. Escorts were 4 British destroyers and 6 corvettes. The convoy commodore was a retired Royal Navy admiral, aged 63, recalled to service for convoy duty. He sailed aboard the lead merchant ship and coordinated the convoy's movements by his signal flags and radio. The route was the standard North Atlantic convoy route. North from New York along the coast to Halifax, where more ships joined. Then northeast into open ocean. Stay south of Iceland to avoid the worst weather. Maintain convoy formation, columns of 4 or 5 ships each, spaced 1,000 yards apart. Zigzag every 15 minutes to make torpedo solutions more difficult. Maintain strict radio silence except for emergencies. Show no lights at night. Hope the U-boats did not find you. For the first 6 days, Convoy SC 121 crossed without incident. The weather was terrible. North Atlantic gales in March, 40-foot waves, wind gusting to 60 knots. Ships pitched violently. Cargo shifted in holds. Men were thrown against bulkheads. Seasickness was universal. But bad weather was preferable to good weather because U-boats could not attack effectively in heavy seas. They could not see targets through waves. They could not maintain periscope depth in rough water. Their torpedoes ran erratically in storm conditions. The merchant seamen prayed for bad weather. On March 12th, the weather cleared. Seas calmed to 10-foot swells. Visibility increased to 15 miles. Perfect conditions for U-boats. That night, the convoy was spotted by U-boat 653. The submarine shadowed at long range, beyond visual contact, using hydrophones to track the convoy's position. The U-boat captain radioed headquarters. Convoy spotted. Position 51 degrees north, 30 degrees west. Course 090. Speed 8 knots. 40-plus ships. U-boat headquarters in France responded immediately. Form Wolf Pack Group ROBRAF. Vector to Convoy SC 121. Attack on night of March 15th. 12 U-boats changed course and converged on the convoy's projected position. They traveled on the surface, running at maximum speed, burning fuel to reach the attack position before the convoy passed. On March 14th, British code breakers at Bletchley Park decrypted German radio traffic and identified the Wolfpack forming. They alerted the Admiralty. The Admiralty radioed a warning to Convoy SC 121's escort commander. Wolfpack forming ahead of convoy. Estimated 12 U-boats. Alter course to avoid. But there was nowhere to alter course to. The U-boats had positioned themselves across the convoy's entire front. North, south, or straight ahead, the convoy would encounter submarines. The escort commander decided to maintain course and prepare for battle. On the night of March 15th, the Wolf Pack attacked. 2300 hours, the first torpedo struck a British freighter in the convoy's port column. The explosion tore open the hull. The ship began sinking immediately. Midnight, 2 more torpedoes hit different ships. One sank in 8 minutes. The other, a tanker, exploded and burned. 100 hours, 3 more ships torpedoed simultaneously. The attacks were coming from multiple directions. The escorts raced through the convoy, dropping depth charges at sonar contacts. Explosions, flares, searchlights, ships burning, complete chaos. By dawn, 9 merchant ships had been sunk. That was over 20% of the convoy. The escorts had damaged 2 U-boats, but sunk none. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On March 16th, the British destroyers received orders to return to base. Their fuel was depleted from high-speed maneuvering during the night battle. They could not escort the convoy to the mid-ocean meeting point where American destroyers were supposed to take over. The corvettes would continue, but corvettes were too slow to chase U-boats and too lightly armed to fight them effectively. The convoy would have minimal protection for the next 2 days. That was when the American destroyers were supposed to arrive at the mid-ocean meeting point, 45 degrees west longitude. But on March 17th, the American destroyers did not arrive at the meeting point. They had been delayed by mechanical problems and weather. They would be 24 hours late. The convoy could not wait. The U-boat Wolfpack was still shadowing, waiting for the next night to attack again. The convoy commodore ordered the convoy to scatter. Every ship on its own. Run for Ireland at maximum speed. Hope the U-boats lose you in the expanse of ocean. That was when Robert Carr stood on the bridge wing of the Mathew Luckenbach and watched the convoy dissolve. 42 ships that had crossed together were now 42 individual targets spread across 100 square miles of ocean. The U-boats would hunt them down one by one. The Mathew Luckenbach ran east at 14 knots. That was her maximum speed, engine straining. The ship vibrated from the propeller turning at full revolutions. Black smoke poured from the stack, making the ship visible for miles. Captain Donahue had no choice. Speed was their only defense. Stop to reduce smoke, and the U-boats would catch them anyway. For 12 hours, the Mathew Luckenbach ran alone across the Atlantic. No other ships visible. No escorts. Just empty ocean and the knowledge that U-boats were somewhere below the surface, searching. At 1600 hours, the lookout spotted a periscope 800 yards off the starboard beam. U-boat 690. The submarine had been tracking the Mathew Luckenbach submerged for 2 hours, positioning for an attack. The armed guard gun crew opened fire with a 5-inch stern gun. The first shot missed by 50 yards. The second shot bracketed the periscope. The U-boat captain decided discretion was preferable to pressing the attack and dove deep. The Mathew Luckenbach altered course and increased speed. For 3 more hours, they saw nothing. Then at 19:15 hours, just before sunset, 2 torpedoes struck the port side simultaneously. The explosions tore massive holes in the hull below the waterline. The ship listed immediately to port. Water flooded the engine room and number 3 hold. The engine stopped. The lights went out. The ship was dead in the water, sinking. Captain Donahue gave the order to abandon ship. The crew had practiced this dozens of times in drills. Everyone knew their lifeboat station. They moved quickly, no panic, professional. For lifeboats, 2 on each side. Capacity for 60 people total, though the crew was only 51. The lifeboats were lowered into the water within 8 minutes. That was faster than any previous drill. The crew had learned from watching other ships sink. Speed was everything. Every second on a sinking ship was a second closer to being pulled under when the ship went down. The Mathew Luckenbach had a 15-degree list to port when Carr climbed down the cargo net into lifeboat number 3. The water was 42 degrees Fahrenheit. North Atlantic in March. Men who fell into the water during the evacuation had perhaps 20 minutes before hypothermia killed them. Carr counted heads in his lifeboat. 14 men. The boat was designed for 15. They had room for 1 more, but no one else was coming. The other lifeboats were pulling away from the ship. Carr gave the order to cast off and row clear. Standard procedure was to get at least 300 yards away before the ship went under. The suction from a sinking ship could pull lifeboats and swimmers down with it. The Mathew Luckenbach sank stern first at 1942 hours, 27 minutes from torpedo impact to disappearing below the surface. Carr watched the bow rise higher and higher until the ship was nearly vertical. Then she slid beneath the waves. The suction was less than expected. The ship had gone down slowly enough that the water had time to equalize. The 4 lifeboats floated in a loose group 300 yards from where the ship had been. Around them, debris from the ship rose to the surface. Wooden crates, life jackets, pieces of deck planking, oil barrels. A slick of fuel oil spread across the water, rainbow-colored in the fading light. Captain Donahue's lifeboat had a radio, battery-powered emergency transmitter. The captain transmitted their position and situation. Ship sunk by torpedo. For lifeboats, 51 crew members, requesting immediate rescue. No response. The radio had a range of perhaps 50 miles. If there were no ships within range, no one would hear the transmission. The nearest land was Ireland, 400 miles to the east. The nearest convoy was scattered across 200 miles of ocean. The nearest rescue ship could be anywhere, or nowhere. The lifeboats had supplies. Water in sealed cans, 3 gallons per boat. Hard biscuits, concentrated chocolate, dried meat. Enough food for 14 men for perhaps 7 days if rationed carefully. Blankets, medical kit, flare gun with 12 flares, compass, sextant, charts. Everything needed to survive at sea until rescue arrived. If rescue arrived, the North Atlantic in March was 53 degrees north latitude. At that latitude in March, sunset came at 1830 hours. Full darkness by 1900 hours. Sunrise not until 0630. That meant over 11 hours of darkness every night. The temperature dropped to 35 degrees Fahrenheit after sunset. The wind increased to 25 knots. The combination of cold air and cold water created conditions that could kill through hypothermia even a lifeboat. The men wore standard merchant marine clothing. Work shirts, dungarees, pea coats, watch caps. No survival suits, no immersion gear. That equipment did not exist yet. The blankets helped, but not enough. Men huddled together for warmth. They took turns rowing to generate body heat through exertion. By midnight, 2 men in Carr's lifeboat were showing signs of hypothermia. Shivering uncontrollably, confusion, slurred speech. Carr wrapped them in additional blankets and moved them to the center of the boat where other men's body heat could warm them. 1 man recovered. The other, a 20-year-old ordinary seaman named Thomas Kowalski from Detroit, lost consciousness at 0200 hours and died at 0315. His core body temperature had dropped too low. His heart simply stopped. They kept his body in the lifeboat. Procedure was to keep bodies until rescue or until decomposition made it necessary to commit them to the sea. The other 3 lifeboats were visible at dawn, spread across perhaps half a mile of ocean. Captain Donahue's boat remained in radio contact with Carr's boat using signal flags. No ship sighted. No aircraft. No rescue. Day 2 at sea began with breakfast. 1 hard biscuit per man. 1 ounce of chocolate. 2 ounces of water. That was the ration Captain Donahue established. Enough to keep men alive for 7 days, maybe 10 if they were lucky and weather permitted them to collect rainwater. The ocean was empty in every direction. No ships, no smoke trails on the horizon, no aircraft contrails overhead. The North Atlantic convoy routes saw dozens of ships daily, but the convoy had scattered. The ships were spread across thousands of square miles. The chances of another ship passing close enough to spot 4 small lifeboats were minimal. The sun rose higher. The temperature increased to 48 degrees. That was warm compared to night, but still cold enough to be dangerous. Men who had been soaked during the evacuation remained damp. Their clothes would not dry in the humid air. Damp clothing accelerated hypothermia. By afternoon, another man in Carr's boat was showing hypothermia symptoms. Able seaman James Morrison, 43 years old, from Brooklyn. He had made 11 Atlantic crossings. He had survived 2 previous sinkings. He was a veteran merchant seaman who knew the ocean intimately. But knowledge did not protect against cold. Carr tried to warm Morrison with blankets and body heat from other men. Morrison's core temperature stabilized, but did not improve. He remained conscious but weak. Night 2 was worse than night 1. The wind increased to 30 knots. Waves built to 15 feet. The lifeboats climbed each wave and crashed down the far side. Water slopped over the gunnels constantly. Men bailed with buckets and helmets and anything that could move water. Everyone was soaked. Everyone was freezing. At 0400 hours, Morrison died. Hypothermia again. That made 2 dead in Carr's boat out of 14 men. 14% casualties in less than 48 hours, and they had not yet faced the worst the North Atlantic could deliver. Day 3 brought fog. Thick, gray fog that reduced visibility to 50 yards. The other lifeboats disappeared from view. Carr's boat was completely alone. The fog was both blessing and curse. Blessing because it insulated them slightly from the wind, reducing heat loss. Curse because no ship or aircraft could possibly spot them in this visibility. They could be 10 yards from a passing ship and never see each other. Carr maintained course toward Ireland by compass. 400 miles at rowing speed meant 20 days minimum. They did not have supplies for 20 days. They did not have time for 20 days. Men were dying from cold, and the cold would only get worse. Day 4, the fog lifted. The wind increased to 40 knots. Gale conditions. Waves built to 25 feet. The lifeboat climbed mountains of water and fell into valleys. Men held on to prevent being thrown overboard. They could not row in these conditions. They could only bail and hold on and wait for the storm to pass. The storm lasted 18 hours. During that time, 1 man was washed overboard. Fireman Samuel Chun, Chinese national, sailing under American merchant marine documents. He had been bailing water when a wave broke over the boat and swept him out. Men grabbed for him, but missed. He disappeared into the waves within seconds. They never saw him again. That made 3 dead in Carr's boat. 21% casualties. The storm passed on day 5. The ocean calmed to 10-foot swells. The sun appeared for the first time since the sinking. The temperature rose to 52 degrees. That was warm enough that men could move without shivering constantly. But the warm weather brought a new problem. Thirst. The water ration was 2 ounces per man per day. That was barely enough to prevent dehydration under normal conditions. After 5 days of exposure, exertion from rowing and bailing, stress, and cold, men needed more. Their bodies were consuming water faster than the ration could replace it. Carr calculated the supplies. 3 gallons of water remaining. 11 men alive in the boat. That was roughly 11 ounces per man if they drank all remaining water immediately. Or they could continue rationing and stretch supplies for another 5 days. Carr chose to continue rationing. 2 ounces per man per day. Some men wanted more. They argued they would die of thirst before rescue arrived. Better to drink now while they could still benefit. Carr refused. As second officer and senior surviving officer in this boat, he had authority. The ration would continue at 2 ounces. Men who wanted more would have to take it by force. No one tried. Merchant seamen understood discipline even though they were civilians. Survival required order. Day 6 brought aircraft. High-altitude contrails, probably a patrol bomber flying reconnaissance. Too high to see lifeboats. Carr fired a flare anyway. The flare arced up 200 feet, burned brilliant red for 30 seconds, fell into the ocean. The aircraft continued on its course without deviation. It had not seen them. That left 11 flares. Day 7 brought another death. Radio operator Michael O'Brien, 36 years old, from Boston. He had been weakening since day 3. Dehydration, hypothermia, exhaustion. His body simply gave up. He died in his sleep during the night between day 6 and day 7. 4 dead out of 14. 28% casualties. Day 8, Carr's boat sighted one of the other lifeboats. Captain Donahue's boat. They rowed to join formation. Donahue reported 3 dead in his boat. The other 2 boats were not visible. Possibly they had drifted apart during the storm. Possibly they had capsized and everyone drowned. No way to know. Donahue's boat still had the emergency radio. He had been transmitting position updates every 6 hours. No responses. Either no one was in range, or the radio was malfunctioning, or rescue ships had more urgent priorities. Convoy SC 121 had lost 9 ships to U-boats before scattering. Those ships had crews totaling perhaps 400 men in lifeboats scattered across 500 miles of ocean. Rescue ships could not possibly locate everyone. Some lifeboats would be found quickly. Others would drift for weeks. Some would never be found at all. Day 9 brought rain. Cold, driving rain that soaked everyone and made conditions miserable. But rain meant fresh water. The men spread blankets to catch rainwater and funneled it into containers. They collected perhaps 2 gallons in 4 hours. That doubled their water supply. Men drank freely for the first time since the sinking. The immediate thirst crisis passed. Day 10 brought a ship. British destroyer HMS Harvester, hunting U-boats south of Iceland. The destroyer spotted Donahue's boat at 1300 hours and altered course to investigate. Carr's boat was 300 yards away. Both boats fired flares. The destroyer closed and stopped. Crew threw lines down. The survivors climbed rope ladders to the deck. 10 men from Carr's boat. 14 men from Donahue's boat. 24 survivors out of 51 crew members from the Mathew Luckenbach. The destroyers searched for the other 2 lifeboats, but found nothing. After 6 hours, the search was abandoned. The destroyer needed to return to convoy escort duty. She could not spend more time searching for lifeboats that might have drifted 50 miles in any direction. The 24 survivors were given dry clothes, hot food, medical attention. 4 men required hospitalization for severe hypothermia and exposure. 2 men had frostbite on fingers and toes. 1 man had pneumonia. The rest were weak, dehydrated, exhausted, but alive. HMS Harvester delivered the survivors to Liverpool on March 28th. 11 days after the Mathew Luckenbach sank. The survivors were debriefed by naval intelligence. They described the convoy, the U-boat attacks, the scattering, the torpedo hit, the time in lifeboats. Intelligence officers wrote detailed reports. The reports were filed and forgotten. There were too many sinkings, too many survivor reports, too many debriefings. The machinery of war moved on. Robert Carr spent 2 weeks in Liverpool recovering. Then he reported to the War Shipping Administration Office to receive his next assignment. The administrator asked if he wanted to continue sailing or take shore duty. Men who had been torpedoed twice were eligible for shore assignments. Carr had been torpedoed once. He could continue sailing if he chose. Carr thought about Thomas Kowalski, frozen to death in a lifeboat at age 20. James Morrison, veteran of 11 crossings, dead from hypothermia after surviving so much. Samuel Chun, washed overboard and drowned in seconds. Michael O'Brien, dead from exhaustion and dehydration. 4 men dead because the convoy had scattered and the lifeboats had drifted for 10 days. 4 men who might have lived if rescue had arrived sooner. But rescue had not arrived sooner because there were not enough rescue ships and not enough escorts and too many U-boats and too many convoys and too much ocean. Carr told the administrator he would continue sailing. Someone had to. The cargo had to get through. The war had to be won. And the war could not be won without merchant seamen willing to cross an ocean where death waited below every wave. The administrator assigned Carr to a new Liberty ship, SS Richard Hovey, departing Liverpool in Convoy ONS-5, returning to New York in ballast. Convoy ONS-5 would become the most controversial convoy of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. 42 merchant ships departed Liverpool on April 21st, 1943. The convoy was escorted by 2 destroyers and 5 corvettes initially, reinforced later by additional escorts, including the British destroyer HMS Duncan and the cutter HMS Sennen. The convoy followed the standard northern route west across the Atlantic. Weather was terrible. Fog, storms, gale force winds. Ships lost formation constantly. The convoy commodore struggled to maintain order. On April 28th, the fog cleared. The convoy's position was approximately 41 degrees north, 46 degrees west, 600 miles from Newfoundland. That was when the Wolf Pack found them. U-boat headquarters had positioned 20 U-boats across the convoy's projected route. Group Star and Group Spect, 41 operational U-boats total, the largest Wolf Pack concentration of the entire war. The U-boats attacked on the night of May 4th into May 5th. The attacks lasted 3 nights. Over 70 torpedoes were fired. 13 merchant ships were sunk. The escorts fought desperately. HMS Duncan depth charged 4 U-boats, sinking 2 and damaging 2 more. HMS Vedette sank U-boat 125. HMS Loosestrife damaged U-boat 638 so severely the submarine could not submerge and was scuttled by her crew. HMS Pelican and HMS Orby, working together, sank U-boat 438. HMS Pelican alone sank U-boat 531. The escorts fought more aggressively than in any previous convoy battle. They used new tactics developed over 3 years of convoy warfare. Support groups of additional escorts arriving from Iceland provided reinforcements. Long-range Liberator aircraft from Iceland provided air cover during daylight hours, forcing U-boats to submerge where they could not keep up with the convoy. For the first time in the Battle of the Atlantic, the escorts achieved a favorable kill ratio. 6 U-boats confirmed sunk for 13 merchant ships lost. Previous battles had seen 20 or 30 merchant ships sunk with 0 or 1 U-boat loss. The balance was shifting. But Robert Carr did not know any strategic analysis while he stood on the bridge of the Richard Hovey and watched torpedoes streak through the dark water on the night of May 4th. He only knew ships were exploding and sinking and men were dying in the freezing water, and his ship might be next. The Richard Hovey was not hit. She arrived in New York on May 14th with the surviving convoy ships. 30 merchant ships out of 42 completed the crossing. Carr had survived his 8th Atlantic convoy. He was 28 years old. He looked 40. Everyone in the merchant marine aged rapidly. The stress, the fear, the exhaustion, the constant proximity to death. Men in their 20s had gray hair. Men in their 30s looked like grandfathers. The Merchant Marine had the highest casualty rate of any American service during World War II. Over 8,000 American merchant seamen died at sea between 1941 and 1945. That was 1 out of every 26 men who served. Approximately 9,400 American merchant seamen were killed during the entire war, including those who died in ports from disease and accidents. Compare that to the Marine Corps, which lost 19,700 men killed in action over 4 years of brutal Pacific combat. The Merchant Marine lost 9,400 men, nearly half the Marine Corps total, from a service 1/10 the size. The death rate for merchant seamen was higher than for Marines, soldiers, sailors, or airmen. The men who died at sea from torpedoes, from exposure in lifeboats, from disease, from accidents, from every cause the ocean could inflict. But the deaths were not distributed evenly across the war. The worst period was 1942 through early 1943. That 15-month period from January 1942 through March 1943 saw over 80% of all merchant marine casualties. The U-boats were winning during those months. They were sinking ships faster than the Allies could replace them. The casualty rate among merchant seamen during that period approached 40% on some routes. 4 out of 10 men who sailed to Murmansk in winter convoys to the Soviet Union died. 1 out of 3 men who sailed to North Africa in late 1942 died. 1 out of 4 men who sailed the North Atlantic route died. These casualty rates were higher than infantry casualty rates in frontline combat units. But merchant seamen kept sailing. Some sailed because they had no choice. The draft deferred merchant seamen because their work was considered essential war service. If they quit sailing, they would be drafted into the Army or Navy. Better to continue in the merchant marine where at least the pay was good. Some sailed because of patriotism. They believed in the cause. They wanted to contribute. They understood that without cargo ships, the Allies could not win. Some sailed because they were professional seamen. The ocean was their life. They had sailed before the war, would sail after the war. War was simply another condition to navigate like storms or fog. Some sailed because they were too young to understand the danger fully. Teenagers signed on as ordinary seamen, attracted by adventure and good pay. They learned the reality after their first sinking. The Richard Hovey made 3 more Atlantic crossings between May and September 1943. Each crossing was less dangerous than the last. The U-boats were withdrawing from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The reasons were multiple and interconnected. Allied escort carriers now provided continuous air cover across the entire Atlantic. Aircraft could detect surfaced U-boats from miles away and attack before the submarines could dive. U-boats that surfaced to chase convoys were immediately bombed or depth-charged. New shipboard radar could detect U-boat periscopes and snorkels at night. The escorts no longer relied on visual spotting or sonar alone. They could find submarines in complete darkness or heavy fog. Radar-equipped aircraft carried depth charges and homing torpedoes that could kill submarines even after they dove. High-frequency direction finding equipment, called Huff Duff by the sailors, allowed escorts to locate U-boats, transmitting radio reports to headquarters. When a U-boat radioed a convoy sighting, every escort in range could triangulate the transmission source and converge on that position within minutes. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park were reading German naval codes with increasing reliability. They could predict where wolf packs would form and route convoys around them. When avoidance was impossible, they could position support groups to reinforce threatened convoys before attacks began. Most critically, the Allies were building escort vessels, and aircraft faster than Germany could build U-boats. In 1943 alone, Allied shipyards launched over 3,000 merchant ships, while German shipyards launched 280 U-boats. But Allied hunters sank 237 U-boats that same year. The Germans were losing submarines faster than they could replace experienced crews. A U-boat crew required months of training. Navigation, engineering, torpedo operations, damage control, emergency procedures. Every man had to master multiple specialties because U-boats operated with minimal crews. When a U-boat was sunk, 44 trained submariners died. Training their replacements took 6 months minimum. By late 1943, German U-boats were being crewed by men with inadequate training, commanded by officers with no combat experience. These inexperienced crews made mistakes. They surfaced at the wrong times, transmitted radio messages that gave away their positions, fired torpedoes from poor attack angles, and failed to evade depth charges effectively. The experienced U-boat commanders, the aces who had survived since 1939 and 1940, were mostly dead by 1944. The few survivors were promoted to staff positions and no longer went to sea. The men replacing them were competent submariners, but not aggressive hunters. They were cautious, defensive, focused on survival rather than sinking tonnage. Admiral Donitz recognized the Battle of the Atlantic was lost by May 1943. He said so explicitly in his memoirs written after the war. The decisive period was March through May 1943. In March, the U-boats sank over 100 Allied ships. In April, they sank 56 ships. In May, they sank 40 ships but lost 43 U-boats. That kill ratio was unsustainable. Donitz was losing more submarines than he was sinking merchant ships. He withdrew the wolf packs from the North Atlantic convoy routes in May 1943 and dispersed them to less defended areas. Caribbean, South Atlantic, Indian Ocean. The U-boats continued to sink ships through 1944 and 1945, but they never again threatened to cut the Atlantic supply lines. The Allies had won the Battle of the Atlantic. But merchant seamen continued to die even after the strategic crisis passed. Ships still hit mines in coastal waters. Ships still collided in fog. Ships still foundered in storms. Ships still caught fire from ammunition or fuel cargo. Ships still suffered engineering casualties that left them dead in the water. And U-boats still operated, fewer in number and less effective, but still deadly to unlucky ships that crossed their paths. Robert Carr transferred to the Pacific Theater in January 1944. The European War was clearly won. The Atlantic was relatively safe. The Pacific War was escalating. American forces were advancing across the Central Pacific, capturing islands, establishing bases, moving closer to Japan. Every advance required supplies: ammunition, food, fuel, construction materials, replacement equipment. Everything came by ship across 6,000 miles of ocean from the American West Coast. The Pacific supply lines were actually more dangerous than the Atlantic supply lines in some ways. Japanese submarines were less effective than German U-boats. They sank fewer merchant ships and posed less strategic threat. But Japanese submarines had orders to execute merchant seamen who survived sinkings. German U-boats sometimes pulled survivors from the water and provided them with course headings to the nearest land. German submarine commanders were naval officers who followed the traditional rules of the sea. Japanese submarine commanders followed different rules. When Japanese submarine I-8 sank the American Liberty ship SS Jean Nicolet in July 1944, the submarine surfaced among the lifeboats. The Japanese sailors' machine gunned the survivors. 96 men died, or survived by hiding under bodies. The survivors reported the massacre when they were finally rescued. The report was classified. The Navy did not want merchant seamen to know what would happen if they were captured by Japanese submarines. Men might refuse to sail if they knew the enemy executed survivors. But merchant seamen learned anyway. Stories spread through union halls and crew quarters. Men who sailed the Pacific routes knew they would be killed if their ship was sunk and the Japanese found them. Surrender was not an option. Survival was not guaranteed, even if you made it to a lifeboat. The Pacific convoys also faced kamikaze attacks, starting in October 1944. Japanese pilots deliberately crashed aircraft loaded with explosives into ships. The attacks were suicidal but devastatingly effective. A single kamikaze hit could sink a cargo ship or tanker. Multiple hits could sink anything. Merchant ships had minimal anti-aircraft defenses. One 3-inch gun, a few 20mm cannons, maybe some 50-caliber machine guns if the Naval Armed Guard detachment was well equipped. Against a determined kamikaze pilot diving at 300 miles per hour, these weapons were nearly useless. The gun crews fired and hoped and prayed. Sometimes they got lucky and shot down the attacking aircraft. Usually they did not. Carr sailed on 6 Pacific convoys between January 1944 and August 1945. 2 ships he sailed on were hit by kamikazes. The first was the SS William Patterson in February 1945, approaching Iwo Jima with ammunition and construction equipment for the invasion force. A Japanese Zero Dove threw anti-aircraft fire and struck the ship's superstructure just after the bridge. The explosion killed 8 men instantly and started fires in the cargo holds. The ship was carrying high explosives. If the fire reached the ammunition, the entire ship would detonate. The crew fought the fire for 6 hours. They flooded the forward holds deliberately, allowing seawater to pour in and suppress the flames. The ship settled lower in the water but remained afloat. A Navy tug towed the William Patterson to Saipan, where the surviving cargo was offloaded and the ship was temporarily repaired. Carr transferred to another ship and continued to Iwo Jima. The second kamikaze hit came in May 1945 aboard the SS Thomas Nelson, approaching Okinawa. 2 Japanese aircraft attacked simultaneously. One was shot down by the escorts. The other crashed into the Thomas Nelson's stern, destroying the steering gear and killing 3 men. The ship could not maneuver. She circled slowly while engineers tried to rig emergency steering. A second kamikaze attack came 30 minutes later. 5 aircraft. The escorts shot down 4. The 5th hit the Thomas Nelson amidships, starting fires and causing flooding. The captain gave the order to abandon ship. This time the evacuation was executed in daylight with calm seas and immediate rescue available. Every surviving crew member was picked up within an hour. The Thomas Nelson burned for 2 days before sinking. Carr was rescued by a destroyer escort and transferred to another merchant ship within a week. By May 1945, The merchant marine had become a routine occupation in a way it had not been in 1942 and 1943. Ships still sank. Men still died. But the massive casualties of the early war period had ended. The convoy system worked. The escorts were effective. Air cover was continuous. The U-boats were beaten. The Japanese submarines were ineffective. The war was clearly ending. Everyone could see it. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. That left only Japan. American bombers were destroying Japanese cities systematically. The Navy had blockaded Japan completely. No food, fuel, or raw materials were reaching the home islands. Japan could not continue fighting much longer. But the invasion of Japan was scheduled for November 1945. Operation Downfall, the largest amphibious operation in history. Millions of troops landing on Japanese beaches. The casualties were projected to be catastrophic. Army planners estimated 500,000 American casualties just for the first phase of the invasion. The merchant marine would have to supply that operation. Thousands of ships carrying millions of tons of cargo across the Pacific. Ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, replacement equipment. Everything needed to sustain armies fighting on Japanese soil. Merchant seamen knew they would be in the middle of it, sailing close to Japanese shores, vulnerable to kamikaze attacks, mines, and artillery fire from shore batteries. The casualty rate would probably return to 1942 levels. Men were prepared to accept it because the war had to be won, but they were not looking forward to it. Then atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. Robert Carr was aboard a Liberty ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean when he heard the news. The ship's radio picked up the broadcast from San Francisco. Japan has surrendered unconditionally. The war is over. The crew gathered on deck and cheered. Some men cried. Everyone felt overwhelming relief. They had survived. They would go home. They would not have to sail into combat zones anymore. They would not have to watch ships sink and friends die. It was over. The merchant marine demobilized rapidly after the war. Most men left immediately. They had served because the war required it. Now the war was over, and they wanted to return to normal life. Some men stayed. Professional seamen who had sailed before the war continued sailing. The post-war merchant fleet was still large, still needed men. The pay was lower without hazard bonuses, but it was steady work. Carr stayed through 1946, sailing commercial routes to Europe and Asia, carrying reconstruction supplies. Then he left the sea and went to college on the GI Bill. He studied engineering, graduated in 1950, worked as a civil engineer in California until retirement in 1978. He rarely talked about the war. When people asked what he had done during the war, he said he had been in the merchant marine. Most people did not know what that meant. They assumed it was something like the Navy. Carr did not explain. The men who had served in the merchant marine understood. The men who had not served could not understand. There was no point trying to explain. The United States government did not recognize merchant mariners as veterans until 1988. For 43 years after the war, merchant seamen received no veterans benefits. No GI Bill, no VA health care, no military retirement, no recognition as veterans. The rationale was that merchant seamen had been civilians under contract, not military personnel under orders. They had been paid well during the war. They had received hazard bonuses. That was their compensation. They deserved nothing more. This decision was controversial even at the time. Army General Douglas MacArthur called the merchant marine essential to victory. He said the merchant seamen had delivered the goods when and where needed through every obstacle the enemy could place in their path. He recommended they receive full veteran status. Navy Admiral Chester Nimitz said the merchant marine had provided the sinews of war across vast ocean distances. He recommended veterans recognition. President Truman in 1946 said the merchant marine had written one of the most brilliant chapters in maritime history. He recommended veterans benefits. Congress disagreed. The rationale was budgetary. The government could not afford to provide veterans benefits to every group that had contributed to the war effort. Lines had to be drawn. The Merchant Marine fell on the wrong side of the line. Robert Carr applied for the GI Bill in 1946 and was denied. He attended college anyway, paying tuition himself. He worked part-time while studying, graduated with debt, paid the debt over 15 years. If he had been classified as a veteran, the government would have paid his tuition and provided a living stipend. But he was not a veteran officially, so he paid his own way. The classification did not bother him as much as the lack of recognition. He had served. He had crossed the Atlantic 8 times under U-boat attack. He had survived 1 sinking and 10 days in a lifeboat. He had watched 4 men die from exposure and hypothermia. He had crossed the Pacific 6 times under kamikaze threat. He had survived 2 kamikaze hits. He had done everything the government had asked of him, and the government said his service did not count as military service. Veterans groups lobbied for merchant marine recognition for decades. The American Legion supported it. The veterans of foreign wars supported it. Individual congressmen introduced bills. The bills failed repeatedly. The opposition came primarily from the Veterans Administration, which argued that expanding veterans' benefits to merchant mariners would create precedent for other groups to demand recognition. Coast Guard civilians, Red Cross workers, USO performers, defense plant workers. Where would the line be drawn? The answer was the line would be drawn at military service. Merchant mariners had not been in the military. Therefore, they were not veterans. The argument ignored the reality that merchant mariners had served in combat zones, had been attacked by enemy forces, had suffered casualties higher than most military units, had been essential to winning the war. But policy is not made on reality. Policy is made on definitions and precedents and budgets. The merchant marine did not fit the definitions, would create bad precedents, and cost too much. So they remained unrecognized. In 1988, Congress finally passed the bill granting veteran status to World War II merchant mariners. The legislation was narrow. Only merchant seamen who had served between December 7, 1941 and August 15, 1945 qualified. Only those who had sailed in combat zones qualified. Only those who could provide documentation of their service qualified. Many men could not provide documentation. Shipping companies had destroyed personnel records decades earlier. The War Shipping Administration had been dissolved in 1946 and its records scattered. Union records were incomplete. Some men had no proof they had served except their own testimony. The VA required documentation. Without documents, claims were denied. Robert Carr was 69 years old when the 1988 law passed. He applied for veterans recognition and was approved. He received a certificate stating he was a veteran. The certificate entitled him to burial in a national cemetery and veterans health care through the VA. He received no back pay for the 43 years he had been denied benefits. He received no compensation for college tuition he had paid himself. He received no acknowledgement that the government had been wrong to deny recognition for 4 decades. He received a certificate and access to VA hospitals. That was all. Carr died in 2003 at age 84. He was buried in Golden Gate National Cemetery with military honors. A Navy honor guard performed the ceremony. The flag was folded and presented to his widow. The bugler played taps. It was a veteran's funeral, proper and respectful. But it came 58 years after the war ended. 58 years after he had survived the sinking of the Mathew Luckenbach and 10 days in a lifeboat. 58 years after he had crossed the Atlantic in convoys under U-boat attack. The recognition came too late for most merchant mariners. Of the 250,000 men who had served in the World War II Merchant Marine, over 90% were dead by 1988 when veteran status was finally granted. The men who had died in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s had died without recognition. They had been buried as civilians, not veterans. Their families had received no survivor's benefits. Their service had not been acknowledged officially. The men who survived until 1988 received certificates and health care and the right to be buried in national cemeteries. But they did not receive what they deserved most: acknowledgement that their service had mattered, that their sacrifices had been real, that they had been soldiers in every way that mattered, even if they had not worn uniforms. The casualty statistics tell the story more clearly than any analysis. 9,400 American merchant mariners killed during World War II. 1 in 26 men who served. Higher casualty rate than the Army, Navy, Marines, or Coast Guard. Higher than the Air Force. Higher than any service except perhaps submarine crews and airborne infantry. The merchant mariners died from torpedoes, from exposure in lifeboats, from kamikaze attacks, from mines, from storms, from disease, from every cause the oceans and the enemy could inflict. They died carrying ammunition to Murmansk in winter convoys where survival rates were 60%. They died carrying fuel to North Africa where U-boats concentrated in the Gibraltar approaches. They died crossing the North Atlantic where wolf packs hunted in the gap beyond air cover. They died approaching Okinawa where kamikazes attacked in waves. They died in every theater of the war, on every ocean, in every condition. And they died as civilians officially, not soldiers, because the government said their service was contractual employment, not military duty. The distinction was legal, but meaningless. The men who died in lifeboats from hypothermia did not die any differently because they were civilians. The men who burned to death when tankers exploded did not suffer less because they had been employed rather than enlisted. The men who drowned when their ships sank did not drown in civilian water, somehow separate from military water. They died in combat, killed by enemy action, serving their country in wartime. That made them soldiers regardless of what the government called them. The ships they sailed on carried the material that won the war. Without merchant ships, Britain would have starved. The Soviet Union would have collapsed. The Mediterranean theater could not have functioned. The Pacific offensive could not have advanced. The entire Allied strategy depended on cargo ships carrying supplies from American ports to every combat zone in the world. The strategic bombing of Germany required aviation fuel delivered by tankers. The invasion of France required ammunition, vehicles, and supplies delivered by cargo ships. The island-hopping campaign in the Pacific required construction equipment and fuel delivered by merchant vessels. The atomic bombs dropped on Japan were transported across the Pacific aboard a cruiser, but the uranium and equipment to build those bombs had been delivered to Pacific bases aboard merchant ships months earlier. Every bullet fired, every gallon of fuel burned, every ration eaten, every piece of equipment used had been transported by merchant ships crewed by merchant mariners who risked their lives crossing oceans where the enemy hunted them constantly. The contribution was absolute and irreplaceable. No merchant marine meant no supplies. No supplies meant no fighting. No fighting meant defeat. Simple as that. Yet the recognition came 43 years late for survivors and never came at all for the majority who had died before 1988. The injustice was profound and inexcusable. Men had served, sacrificed, and died. The government had promised nothing and delivered exactly that for 4 decades. When recognition finally came, it came too late to matter for most. The lesson is clear but uncomfortable. Service is not always recognized. Sacrifice is not always acknowledged. Men who do extraordinary things in wartime are sometimes forgotten in peace. The merchant mariners were forgotten deliberately, not through oversight, but through policy. The government decided their service did not qualify for recognition and maintained that position for 4 decades despite lobbying, despite evidence, despite the obvious injustice. Why? The official reason was budgetary concern and precedent. The real reason was probably simpler. The merchant marine had no powerful constituency. They had no generals advocating for them, no admirals defending them, no political organization lobbying for them. They were scattered across the country, working civilian jobs, disconnected from each other and from military veterans groups. They had no voice and no power, so they were ignored. The story of the merchant marine in World War II is ultimately a story about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. The combat infantryman who stormed beaches is remembered. The bomber pilot who flew missions over Germany is remembered. The submarine commander who sank enemy ships is remembered. The merchant seaman who carried the ammunition for the infantryman, the fuel for the bomber, and the torpedoes for the submarine is forgotten. Not because his contribution was less important, not because his sacrifice was less real, but because his service was less visible, less dramatic, less celebrated. He did not storm beaches. He did not bomb cities. He did not sink warships. He sailed cargo ships through submarine-infested waters and hoped he would not be torpedoed. When he was torpedoed, he climbed into lifeboats and hoped he would be rescued before hypothermia killed him. When he was rescued, he returned to port, signed on to another ship, and sailed again into the same waters where he had nearly died. That was his service. Unglamorous, repetitive, necessary, deadly. 9,400 men died doing it. They deserved recognition. They received it 4 decades late or not at all. That is the final lesson of the merchant marine in World War II. Service matters. Sacrifice matters. But recognition is not guaranteed. Sometimes the men who contribute most receive the least acknowledgement. Sometimes the most essential service is the most overlooked. The merchant mariners were essential to victory. They were overlooked for 4 decades. Their story should be remembered not only for what they accomplished, but for how long they were forgotten. And we should remember that forgetting them was a choice, not an accident. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.